Good afternoon. So I'm all that stands between everyone and cocktails. It's quite an introduction. So I hope to be interesting enough to keep your mind from wandering. So today I am going to talk a little bit about what we might call our diversity and inclusion journey. Let me just make sure that I know what I'm doing. Okay. So today, as has already been announced, I'm Lisa Coleman. I'm going to talk a little bit about assets to advantage-based models. So when I think about this, I think about we're all on a collective journey, right? We're on a diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity journey. Many of our organizations are on that journey, and where they are on that journey is very different. I forgot I don't have to stand there. So where they are is very different, right? And so I work at a university, I worked at another university, and I always say this. I worked at a university called Harvard before, and now I work at NYU. And what they have in common is nothing. They're a university. One's an apple and one's a giraffe, okay? They're on totally different diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity journeys, all right? But the question is, in my role, right, what am I doing? I can't do it alone. We can't do these diversity, inclusion, belonging, transformation in South Africa, human rights in Canada, that's the nomenclature. We can't do these alone. But we can cast a stone, right? And we can create a lot of different ripples. And the question is, where do those ripples connect, and how do they connect? The research. There's lots of research, and you've heard about some of this today. Whether it's my friend Mahzarin Banaji at Harvard and her colleague Anthony Greenwald at Ohio State, which is where Mahzarin began, and their work on unconscious bias, or whether it's Gerald Wing Su at UCLA and his work on microaggressions, or whether it's one of the very, very early beginnings with Claude Steele and his work on stereotype threat, and that's there at the bottom. Right, there's lots of research, and we can think of companies like Cook-Ross and et cetera who are doing work on bias. And then we have lots of diversity trainings across all of our companies and organizations. And then do you know what happens? An article comes out in the Harvard Business Review, and it says, diversity trainings don't work. And then do you know what happens when you work at Harvard? Everyone calls you and says, Lisa, this is your fault. Is this true? My entire company has been doing diversity trainings for 10 years, and are you trying to say it doesn't work? Well, the answer is a little more complicated than that. So what we know from the research is some work and some don't, and I'll come back to that. There's a lot more to diversity and inclusion than meets the eye. Right? In the old sort of paradigms of the 1950s and 1960s, it was about race, gender, maybe ability, sometimes religion. But what we know is that diversity and inclusion, belonging, and equity is not just about these identificatory characteristics, right? It's much broader, and we can think about that with our ERGs. Because now what we're seeing with employee resource groups is the emergence of employee resource groups that are connected to, yes, those old sort of identificatory characteristics, right? African American, disabled, right? Differently abled, women, gender. But we also know that we have ERGs that are emerging that are related to the business or the mission, right? Women in technology, women for partnerships with external companies. And I'll come back to this, but this is an important shift when we think about the work that ERGs are doing in our companies. Often what we find in our approaches to our diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity work is this. There's a Lone Ranger. Her name is Lisa. She comes into your organization and she's going to transform the entire organization. There are 80,000 people, but she's going to do it by herself. Because she's a superstar. Some of you have that role right now. Yes? So we have Lone Ranger approaches. We have atomized approaches. So something happens, and it's a crisis, and we have to deal with that crisis, and then it goes away, and then the next time something emerges, it's a new crisis, seemingly new. Sometimes it's personality-driven. Right? She or he is such a great diversity officer, they know how to get along with everybody. That's me. Right. So, then it's treated, right, always as a crisis in organic evolution. Very little planning. So the question really is that we have to ask ourselves is, what is our collective gut as an organization? Who are we as an organization? What are our values? Now, some of this you can't read, I think the slide is a little blurry, but one of the words that's on the slide is bacteria. This is a slide from MIT. And what we know about bacteria is that we have good bacteria and we have bad bacteria. And what I'm interested in is, how do we leverage the good bacteria? How do we think about what's in the gut of our organization that we can leverage and move forward? Our organizational cultures, and you all already know this definition, is our values, our behaviors that contribute to our social and psychological environment. But it's also the economics and the histories of our organizations. Because our histories often tell us where we are. Maybe not where we're going, but where we are. And our economics often tell us how we've aligned what matters in our organization. I have a statement that I use when I'm sort of doing my diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity work. And what I say is, if my diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity work is not aligned with my financial plan, then I'm not doing diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity work. Because I don't have any resources to do it. Right? So I have to look at, if everything else in the organizations has resources and has a financial plan, so does my diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity work. When we're looking at our organizational culture, we have to look at what defines our organizational culture. And far too often, we only look at the cultures and values of the leaders. But we know that leadership, right, helps define some of our organizational culture. But as I said before, it's our histories. It's the things that we have valued over time. It's those traditions. And those traditions get married into systems of policies and procedures, right? At organizations sometimes where I've worked, they'll say things like this: we've always done it this way, and we always will, because it's the right way. Yes? That's marrying with systems and policies and procedures. Thinking about those everyday organizational tasks, those very things that we do every day, tell us a little bit about what matters in our culture. What matters in my culture is research. Right? In higher education, research matters more than almost anything else. So when people talk about the bottom line, and they ask questions about the bottom line in higher education, it's about knowledge production. It's about producing research. It's not often about the very bottom line that some other organizations have. But you have to know that, because you have to think about where your resources are, where your technologies are, and how your constituents are thinking about your organization in relation to the culture and climate. What we know, and you all have heard this, I'm sure, more often than you would like, is culture eats strategy. Culture eats strategy every day of the week. But it eats people too. Yeah, gobble, gobble. Right? We bring new people into our organization, and we want them to fit. And we define fit in certain kinds of ways. And if they don't fit, we gobble them up or spit them out. Right? So we're thinking about inclusion, diversity, and belonging. So I'll pause here to say, the former speakers were talking about diversity and inclusion, right, and getting to inclusion. So what we know about diversity is we can have, as Verna Meyer says, the people in the room, we have diversity in the room. And then inclusion is bringing those people together, as Verna says, right, in the dance. But in terms of belonging and equity, we have to make sure that for belonging, that people feel like they're part enough of our organization that when they offer something new, they just don't get kicked out and cast off. That's when you know you don't belong, right? You get kicked out of the group real easy. I've gotten kicked out of a lot of groups, so I know.